The bullet shattered the window of the stagecoach just as it careened around the bend, sending splinters of glass across Lillian Carter's lap like deadly rain. She had been traveling from Sacramento to Sonora, California, in the spring of 1878, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter that promised her a teaching position at the new schoolhouse. Now, as masked riders surrounded the coach on all sides, their guns blazing and their horses kicking up clouds of dust that choked the air, she realized she might never reach that schoolhouse at all. The driver slumped forward with a groan, blood spreading across his shoulder, and the horses began to veer wildly off the road toward a steep embankment. Lillian's scream caught in her throat as the coach tilted dangerously, and she grabbed onto the leather strap with both hands, her knuckles white and her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst right through her ribcage. The coach came to a violent stop against a boulder, throwing Lillian against the door so hard that stars exploded across her vision. She could hear the bandits shouting to each other, their voices rough and eager as they approached. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, their faces hidden behind dirty red bandanas. One of them yanked open the door, and Lillian found herself staring down the barrel of a revolver. The man's eyes were cold and pale, like dirty ice, and when he smiled she could see his teeth were stained brown from chewing tobacco. "Well now, what do we have here?" he drawled, reaching in to grab her arm. His fingers dug into her flesh hard enough to bruise, and Lillian tried to pull away, but he was too strong. "Looks like we got ourselves a pretty little bird. Come on out, sweetheart. Let's see what you got in that bag." Lillian's voice came out thin and trembling. "Please, I don't have anything valuable, just clothes and books." The bandit laughed, a sound like gravel scraping against metal. "We'll be the judge of that." He hauled her out of the coach, and she stumbled, her traveling dress catching on the door frame and tearing with a sharp ripping sound. The other bandits had already pulled down the strongbox from the boot and were trying to shoot off the lock. The driver lay motionless on the ground, and Lillian couldn't tell if he was breathing. Another bandit, taller than the first with a scar running down his neck, snatched her carpetbag and dumped its contents onto the ground. Her spare dress, her undergarments, her precious books, all fell into the dirt. When they found nothing of value, the scarred man turned to her with narrowed eyes. "Where's your jewelry? Your money?" "I don't have any," Lillian said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I'm a schoolteacher. I barely have enough for room and board." The first bandit grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. "Maybe we should take you instead. Pretty thing like you could fetch a good price down in Mexico." Terror flooded through Lillian's body like ice water. Her hands began to shake, first just a tremor, then a violent shaking that she couldn't control. Her whole body followed, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. She tried to step back, but the bandit still had hold of her arm, and she could smell whiskey and sweat on him, could see the cruel amusement in his eyes as he watched her fear. That was when the first shot rang out, sharp and clear as a church bell. The bandit holding Lillian jerked and spun around, his gun coming up, but another shot followed and the revolver went flying from his hand. He yelped and grabbed his wrist, blood streaming between his fingers. The other bandits scattered like startled crows, diving for cover behind the overturned coach and the rocks that lined the road. "Let the woman go," a voice called out, calm and steady, carrying across the dusty air with absolute authority. "Do it now, and you might live to see sunset." Lillian couldn't see where the voice was coming from. The sun was high and bright, turning everything into harsh light and deep shadow. The bandit still had her arm, but his grip had loosened, and she could feel uncertainty in the way he shifted his weight. "Who the hell are you?" The scarred bandit shouted from behind the coach. Someone who doesn't take kindly to men who terrorize defenseless women, the voice replied. I'm going to count to 3. 1. The bandit holding Lillian suddenly shoved her forward, sending her sprawling into the dirt, and drew another gun from his belt. Take him, he shouted to his companions. 2. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Lillian pressed herself flat against the ground, her hands over her head, dust and gunpowder filling her nose and mouth. She heard men cursing, horses screaming, the ping of bullets striking metal and rock. The chaos lasted less than a minute but felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the noise had been. Footsteps approached, slow and measured. Lillian squeezed her eyes shut, not knowing if it was the bandits returning or her mysterious rescuer. A shadow fell across her, blocking the sun. Madam, the voice was gentle now, concerned. Are you hurt? Lillian opened her eyes and found herself looking up at a man who seemed carved from the very landscape around them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that brushed his collar. His eyes were a striking green, the color of new leaves in spring, and they were studying her with genuine worry. He wore dusty range clothes, a worn leather vest over a blue shirt, and a gun belt that sat low on his hips. In his hand was a smoking Colt revolver that he was already holstering. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her hands were shaking worse than ever, her whole body trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't seem to catch her breath, couldn't seem to make her lungs work properly. Everything felt too bright, too loud, too much. The man knelt beside her, moving slowly as if approaching a frightened animal. Hey now, he said softly. You're safe. They're gone. Can you breathe for me? But Lillian couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, locked up, and black spots were dancing at the edges of her vision. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't support her weight. The man reached out and gently took both of her shaking hands in his own. His hands were large and calloused, warm and steady, and they held hers with surprising gentleness. Look at me, he said, and there was something in his voice that cut through her panic. Just look at me. Nothing else. Lillian focused on his face, on those calm green eyes that seemed to anchor her to the present moment. Breathe with me slow, he said, taking a deep, deliberate breath and letting it out slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth, like this. Follow me. He breathed in again, holding her hand still, and Lillian tried to match him. The first breath came out as a gasp, broken and harsh, but he didn't let go. He just kept breathing, slow and steady, and gradually Lillian found her own breath beginning to match his rhythm. In, out, in, out. The shaking in her hands began to ease, though they still trembled in his grip. That's good, he murmured. Keep going, you're doing fine. They stayed like that for several minutes, kneeling in the dust beside the overturned coach, while he held her hands and they breathed together. Slowly, the world stopped spinning. The black spots receded. Lillian's heartbeat began to return to something resembling normal, though she still felt shaky and weak. Better? He asked gently. Lillian nodded, not trusting her voice yet. She became suddenly aware that she was covered in dust. Her dress was torn, her hair had come loose from its pins and was hanging around her face in tangled strands. She must look like a mad woman. But the man didn't seem to notice or care. He just held her hands and watched her with patient concern. I'm Yates Fletcher, he said after a moment. I have a ranch about 5 miles north of Sonora. I was heading into town when I heard the shooting. Lillian Carter, she managed to whisper. I was going to Sonora to teach at the school. Yates glanced over at the coach, then at the driver who lay motionless on the ground. His expression darkened. Stay here, he said, gently releasing her hands. He stood and walked over to the driver, kneeling to check for a pulse. After a moment he looked back at Lillian and shook his head. "I'm sorry. He's gone." Fresh tears sprang to Lillian's eyes. She hadn't known the driver, had only exchanged a few pleasantries with him at the last station, but he had died protecting the coach and its passengers. Died protecting her. Yates gathered up her scattered belongings, carefully folding her clothes and placing them back in the carpet bag with a consideration that surprised her. He picked up each book and brushed off the dust before tucking them away. When he had everything collected, he brought the bag over and set it beside her. "The bandits ran off," he said. "I winged 2 of them, but they were more interested in escaping than fighting. They'll think twice before hitting another coach at least." He looked at the overturned vehicle, at the dead driver, at the frightened horses that had tangled themselves in their traces. "This coach isn't going anywhere today. I can take you into Sonora on my horse, if you're able to ride." Lillian nodded, though the thought of getting on a horse right now made her stomach turn. "I can manage." But when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Yates caught her before she could fall, one arm around her waist, supporting her weight easily. He was warm and solid and smelled of leather and horse and something clean like pine soap. Lillian felt her face heat with embarrassment. "Sorry," she whispered. "I don't know what's wrong with me." "You just survived an attack by armed bandits," Yates said matter-of-factly. "I'd be more concerned if you weren't shaken up. Give yourself a moment." He helped her over to a flat rock in the shade, and she sat down gratefully. Her legs felt like water, her whole body still trembling with aftershocks of fear. Yates moved around the scene with quiet efficiency, checking the strong box, which the bandits had managed to open and empty, and calming the horses. He was gentle with the animals, speaking to them in a low, soothing voice as he worked to untangle their leads. After several minutes, Lillian felt strong enough to try standing again. This time she managed it, though she still felt unsteady. Yates brought over his horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding with a white blaze on its face, and helped Lillian into the saddle. Then he swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. Lillian stiffened for a moment, suddenly aware of how close he was, how intimate this arrangement felt, but there was nothing improper in the way he held himself, or in the careful distance he maintained. "Hold on to the saddle horn," he said. "It's about an hour's ride to town. We'll take it slow." They left the scene of the attack behind, and Lillian was grateful not to look back at it. Yates had covered the driver's body with a blanket from the coach and promised to send someone back for him as soon as they reached Sonora. The afternoon sun beat down on them as they rode, and the rhythmic movement of the horse gradually began to calm Lillian's frayed nerves. "Thank you," she said after they had been riding for a while. Her voice sounded small and thin to her own ears. "For saving me, for everything." "No need to thank me," Yates replied. "Any decent man would have done the same." "I'm not sure that's true," Lillian said, thinking of how the bandits had looked at her, of what they had threatened. She shuddered despite the warmth of the day. She felt Yates shift behind her. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "I give you my word. I'll see you safely to town and make sure you get where you're going." There was something in his voice, a solid certainty, that made Lillian believe him. They rode in silence for a while, following a dusty road that wound through scrubby hills dotted with oak trees. In the distance, Lillian could see higher mountains, their peaks still touched with snow despite the advancing spring. The land was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, so different from the green valleys of Ohio where she had grown up. "What brings a schoolteacher all the way to Sonora?" Yates asked eventually. "It's rough country out here." "My father passed away last winter," Lillian said. "And my mother 2 years before that. I have a younger brother, but he's married now with his own family." There was nothing keeping me in Ohio, and I wanted to go somewhere I could make a real difference. I heard that California needs teachers, especially in the smaller towns. That's true enough, Yates said. There are more children in Sonora than there are proper schools. The last teacher left about 6 months ago, went back east, said the frontier was too wild for him. There was a hint of amusement in his voice. You don't strike me as the type to scare easily, though. Most women would have fainted dead away after what you just went through. I nearly did, Lillian admitted. If you hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened. But I was there, Yates said firmly. No use dwelling on what might have been. Lillian found herself curious about this quiet, capable man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. You said you have a ranch. Do you run it alone, mostly? I have a couple of hands who help during branding and roundup, but day to day it's just me. I raise cattle, some horses. It's not a big operation, but it keeps me fed and busy. No family. There was a pause before Yates answered. My parents died when I was young, cholera. I was raised by my uncle up in the gold country. When he passed 5 years ago, he left me his stake and I used it to buy the ranch. Never married, if that's what you're asking. Lillian blushed, grateful that he couldn't see her face. I wasn't prying. Just making conversation. No offense taken. She could hear the smile in his voice. What about you? No husband or beau waiting back in Ohio? No, I was engaged once, but he broke it off when he found out my father lost his business. Turns out he was more interested in my dowry than in me. The old hurt had faded to a dull ache, more wounded pride than heartbreak. That was 2 years ago. Then he was a fool, Yates said simply. Any man who can't see past money to the person isn't worth having. The unexpected kindness in his words made Lillian's throat tight. She blinked back sudden tears and focused on the road ahead. In the distance, she could see buildings beginning to appear, the outskirts of Sonora coming into view. The town had grown up around the gold rush, though the easy gold was long gone now. What remained was a working town, rough around the edges but solid, filled with miners and ranchers and merchants trying to make honest livings. Yates guided the horse through the main street, past the saloons and general stores, the blacksmith shop and the assayer's office. People turned to stare as they passed, and Lillian was acutely aware of how she must look, disheveled and dusty, riding pressed against a strange man. She tried to sit up straighter, to maintain some dignity, but exhaustion was catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. The hotel is just up here, Yates said, pulling the horse to a stop in front of a 2-story wooden building with a painted sign that read, The Gold Country Hotel. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Lillian down. Her legs nearly gave out again when her feet hit the ground, and Yates steadied her with his hands on her waist. Easy now, he murmured. You've had a rough day. The hotel proprietor, a stout woman with steel-gray hair and shrewd eyes, came bustling out onto the porch. Lord have mercy, what happened to this poor girl? Stagecoach was attacked about 10 miles out, Yates explained. The driver didn't make it. Miss Carter needs a room and probably a hot meal. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Brennan, took charge immediately. She ushered Lillian inside, clucking sympathetically and firing questions at Yates about the attack. Within minutes, Lillian found herself in a small but clean room upstairs, with Mrs. Brennan promising to bring hot water and food. Yates stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking oddly uncertain for the first time since Lillian had met him. I need to go find the sheriff, let him know what happened. He'll want to organize a posse to go after those bandits, and someone needs to retrieve the driver's body. Will you be all right here? Lillian nodded, though the thought of him leaving made her feel unexpectedly anxious. I'll be fine. Thank you again, Mr. Fletcher. I owe you my life. Yates, he said, Just Yates, and you don't owe me anything." He hesitated, then added, "I'll come by tomorrow morning if that's all right. Make sure you're settled in properly. The school board will want to meet you, and I know the chairman. I can introduce you." "You don't have to do that," Lillian said, though she was touched by the offer. "I know I don't have to," Yates replied, "but I'd like to if you'll let me." Something in his green eyes made Lillian's heart skip. She found herself nodding. "All right, thank you. I'd appreciate that." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his serious face and made him look younger, more approachable. "Get some rest, Miss Carter. Tomorrow things will look brighter." After he left, Lillian sank onto the bed and let out a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling again, though not as badly as before. She could still feel the ghost of his touch, the way his hands had held her steady, the sound of his voice telling her to breathe. She closed her eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath, the way he had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Mrs. Brennan arrived with a basin of hot water and some soap, followed shortly by a plate of roasted chicken, potatoes, and green beans. The food was simple but well prepared, and Lillian realized she was ravenous. She hadn't eaten since early that morning, and it was now late afternoon. While she ate, Mrs. Brennan sat in the room's only chair and filled her in on the local news, pointing out which people to trust and which to avoid, where to shop for the best prices, and which saloons to never go near under any circumstances. "That Yates Fletcher is a good man, Mrs. Brennan said at one point, giving Lillian a knowing look. "Keeps to himself mostly, works hard, doesn't drink or gamble. Every unmarried woman in town has set her cap for him at one time or another, but he never shows interest. Too busy with that ranch of his, I suppose." Lillian felt her face heat. "He was very kind to me today." "I'm sure he was," Mrs. Brennan said with a smile. "Like I said, he's a good man. We could use more like him around here." After Mrs. Brennan left, Lillian washed and changed into her spare dress, grateful that her clothes had survived the attack relatively intact. One of her books had a torn cover, and several pages were bent, but that could be repaired. She sat by the window and looked out at the street below, watching as the afternoon faded into evening. Lanterns were being lit up and down the main street, casting pools of golden light onto the wooden sidewalks. She could hear piano music drifting from one of the saloons, voices raised in laughter and conversation. This was her new home now. Sonora, California. A frontier town that was still rough and dangerous, as the day's events had proven. But it was also a place where a man like Yates Fletcher would risk his life for a stranger, where a woman like Mrs. Brennan would take in someone in need without hesitation. There was goodness here along with the danger, kindness along with the hardship. Lillian thought about Yates, about the way he had knelt beside her in the dust and held her hands until she could breathe again. About the gentle way he had collected her belongings, the steadiness of his presence, the calm authority in his voice when he had faced down the bandits. She had never met anyone quite like him. She went to bed early, exhausted by the day's trauma, but sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the bandits' cold eyes, heard the gunfire, felt the terror of those moments when she had been certain she was going to die. She would jerk awake, heart pounding, and have to remind herself that she was safe now, that the door was locked and Mrs. Brennan was downstairs and the bandits were long gone. Finally, around midnight, she got up and sat by the window again. The town was quieter now, most of the businesses closed, though she could still hear music from the saloons. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light over everything. Lillian thought about her parents, about her brother back in Ohio, about the life she had left behind. She wondered if she had made the right choice coming here, if she was strong enough for this harsh new world. Then she thought about Yates again, about the way his eyes had held hers while he taught her to breathe, and something warm unfurled in her chest. She barely knew him, had only met him under the worst possible circumstances, but she found herself looking forward to seeing him again tomorrow. Found herself wanting to know more about the quiet rancher who had saved her life. Morning came eventually, pale gold light creeping across the mountains and spilling into the valley where Sonora lay. Lillian dressed carefully in her best remaining dress, a deep blue cotton with white piping at the collar and cuffs, and did her best to arrange her hair into something presentable. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the washstand was pale and had dark circles under the eyes, but there was nothing to be done about that. She went downstairs to find Mrs. Brennan serving breakfast in the hotel's small dining room. There were only a few other guests, all men, who tipped their hats politely when Lillian entered but otherwise left her alone. She was halfway through a plate of eggs and biscuits when she heard the front door open and Mrs. Brennan's cheerful greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Fletcher." "She's in the dining room just finishing breakfast." Lillian's heart did an unexpected flip. She set down her fork and smoothed her skirt, suddenly nervous. Yates appeared in the doorway a moment later, hat in hand, looking clean and rested. He had shaved and was wearing a fresh shirt, though his pants and boots were still the worn work clothes of a rancher. When he saw Lillian, his serious face softened into a smile. "Miss Carter, how are you feeling this morning?" "Better, thank you," Lillian said, and it was true. The night had been difficult, but the morning light had brought new strength. "Please sit down. Have you eaten?" "Hours ago," Yates said, but he sat across from her anyway, setting his hat on the empty chair beside him. "I'm an early riser, usually up before dawn to tend the stock, Mrs." Brennan appeared with coffee for both of them, giving Lillian another one of those knowing smiles before bustling away. Lillian wrapped her hands around the warm cup and studied Yates across the table. In the morning light, she could see details she had missed yesterday. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the strength in his jaw and the gentleness in his mouth. "I spoke with the sheriff last night," Yates said. "He's gathering a posse to go after those bandits, though the trail will be cold by now." They also retrieved the driver's body. His name was George Morrison. He had a wife and 2 children in Sacramento. The coach company will take care of them, but it's a hard thing. Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. That poor family. "The sheriff will want to speak with you at some point, get your account of what happened, but I told him to give you a few days to settle in first." He agreed. "That was kind of you," Lillian said. "I'm not sure I'm ready to relive it all just yet." "Take all the time you need," Yates said. His green eyes were warm with understanding. "Now, if you're finished with breakfast, I thought we could walk over to the school. The building is ready, and I can introduce you to Reverend Gaines. He's the chairman of the school board and a good man. He'll be glad to finally meet you. Your letter said you'd be arriving this week, but no one knew exactly when." Lillian finished her coffee and went upstairs to collect her bonnet, and the letter confirming her appointment. When she came back down, Yates was waiting by the door, and he offered her his arm as they stepped out into the morning sunshine. The gesture was so natural, so old-fashioned and courteous, that Lillian found herself charmed by it. Sonora looked different in daylight, less intimidating than it had seemed the evening before. The main street was busy with morning traffic, wagons hauling supplies, horses tied to hitching posts, people going about their business. Several folks called out greetings to Yates as they passed, and he nodded politely in return. Lillian noticed that more than a few women watched them with interest, their eyes lingering on the way Lillian's hand rested on Yates's arm. The school was at the edge of town, A new wooden building with a bell tower and real glass windows. It was larger than Lillian had expected, with a small house attached to one side. Yates explained that the house was meant as living quarters for the teacher, if she or he wanted to use it. The previous teacher had preferred to stay at the hotel, but it was available for Lillian if she chose. Inside, the school was a single large room with rows of desks, a pot-bellied stove for heat, and a proper blackboard across the front wall. There were maps on the walls, a globe on the teacher's desk, and shelves waiting to be filled with books. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making everything bright and clean. "It's wonderful," Lillian breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Much better than I expected." "The town raised the money themselves," Yates said with pride. "Took 2 years of fundraising, but everyone contributed what they could. Education is important out here, especially for the children who don't have much else." A throat cleared behind them, and they turned to find a tall, thin man with graying hair and kind eyes standing in the doorway. He wore a minister's collar and was smiling warmly. "You must be Miss Carter," he said, coming forward to shake her hand. "I'm Reverend Gaines. We're so pleased you've arrived safely. When we heard about the attack on the stage, we feared the worst." Word traveled fast in small towns. Lillian was learning. She shook the Reverend's hand and listened as Yates recounted yesterday's events, leaving out the more frightening details, but making it clear that Lillian had been through a difficult experience. Reverend Gaines was immediately sympathetic and insisted that Lillian take a few days to recover before starting her duties. "The children are eager to begin classes," he said, "but they can wait a bit longer. You need time to settle in, to make the living quarters comfortable if you choose to use them. Let me show you around." The living quarters were modest but adequate. A bedroom, a small sitting room, and a kitchen with a wood stove. The furniture was simple but well made, and there were cheerful curtains at the windows. Lillian could easily imagine making a home here, could picture herself grading papers at the little desk in the sitting room or preparing lessons at the kitchen table. "I think I'd like to live here," she told Reverend Gaines. "It's perfect." They discussed practical matters for a while: salary and schedule, the number of students expected, the curriculum she would be teaching. Yates stood quietly to the side, letting them talk, but Lillian was aware of his presence the whole time, found it comforting. When they finally finished, and Reverend Gaines excused himself to attend to other matters, Yates helped Lillian bring her few belongings over from the hotel. "You're being very kind to me," Lillian said as Yates carried her trunk into the bedroom. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," Yates said, setting the trunk down carefully. "Besides, I like helping. Makes me feel useful for something other than wrangling cattle." "I'm sure you're useful for many things," Lillian said, then blushed at how that sounded. "I mean, I'm sure you're a very capable person." Yates smiled, that warm smile that transformed his face. "I understood what you meant. Now you need supplies. Food, firewood, lamp oil, all the things that make a house a home. The general store is back on Main Street. Let me take you there." "You don't have to keep spending your day on me," Lillian protested, though truthfully she was glad for his company. The thought of navigating the town alone, of facing strangers after yesterday's trauma, made her anxious. "I know I don't have to," Yates said, "but my ranch can spare me for one more day. Come on." The general store was a treasure trove of supplies, everything from flour and sugar to fabric and hardware. The proprietor, a jovial man named Mr. Chen, who had come to California during the gold rush and stayed to build a business, greeted them warmly and helped Lillian select what she needed. Yates carried the packages back to the school, making 2 trips without complaint, and even helped her stock the kitchen shelves and stack firewood by the stove. By the time they finished, it was early afternoon and Lillian was exhausted. The lack of sleep from the night before was catching up with her, and her body still ached from being thrown around in the coach. Yates noticed her flagging energy and insisted she rest. "I need to get back to the ranch," he said, standing in the doorway of her new home. "But I'll come by tomorrow, see how you're settling in, if that's all right with you." "I'd like that," Lillian said, and realized she meant it deeply. The thought of him leaving made her feel unexpectedly lonely. "Will I see you at church on Sunday?" "I'm not much of a churchgoer," Yates admitted. "But maybe I'll make an exception this week." After he left, Lillian stood in the doorway and watched him ride away on his chestnut horse, a tall figure silhouetted against the bright sky. She touched her chest, where her heart was beating faster than it should, and wondered what was happening to her. She barely knew this man, had only met him yesterday under the worst possible circumstances. But something about him called to her, made her feel safe and seen and understood in a way she never had before. She spent the rest of the afternoon arranging her few possessions, making the little house her own. She hung her spare dress in the wardrobe, set her books on the shelf in the sitting room, placed the photograph of her parents on the bedside table. The work was soothing, helping to settle her nerves and give her a sense of purpose. By evening, the house felt lived in, felt like it could become a home. That night, sleep came more easily. She still woke once from a nightmare about the bandits, but the fear faded quickly in the familiar darkness of her own bedroom. She got up and drank some water, looked out the window at the moonlit town, and thought about Yates telling her to breathe slow. She practiced it now, in and out, until her heartbeat calmed and she felt ready to sleep again. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Reverend Gaines brought several of the mothers from the town to meet her, and they were all warm and welcoming, offering advice and assistance. She learned that the school would have about 30 students, ranging in age from 6 to 14, from various backgrounds. There were children of miners and ranchers, children of shopkeepers and laborers, even a few children from the Chinese community, and the Mexican families who had lived in the area for generations. It would be challenging to teach such a diverse group, but Lillian found herself excited by the prospect. True to his word, Yates came by the next day and the day after that. The first time, he brought a rocking chair that he had made himself, saying every home needed one. The second time, he brought fresh vegetables from his ranch and showed her how to properly bank the fire in the stove so it would last through the night. He never stayed long, always finding some excuse for his visit, some small task that needed doing. But Lillian looked forward to his visits with an intensity that surprised her. On Sunday, Lillian attended church for the first time. The small wooden chapel was packed, every pew filled with townspeople dressed in their best clothes. Reverend Gaines gave a sermon about community and helping one's neighbors, and Lillian couldn't help but think of Yates, who embodied those values without needing to be told. She was sitting with Mrs. Brennan and some of the other women when she noticed Yates slip into the back pew, hat in hand. Her heart leaped at the sight of him. After the service, Yates made his way through the crowd to her side. "Miss Carter, you look well." "Thank you. I am well." Lillian smiled up at him. "I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you weren't much of a churchgoer." "I'm not," Yates said. "But I figured I should make the effort, at least once in a while. People will talk otherwise." Lillian wasn't sure what he meant by that, but before she could ask, several of the townspeople came over to speak with them. She noticed the curious glances, the knowing smiles, the way people seemed to accept Yates and her as a unit, as if it were natural that they would be together. It should have bothered her, should have made her anxious about her reputation, but instead it felt right. After church, Yates asked if she would like to take a walk. "There's a trail that leads up into the hills behind town," he said. "Beautiful view up there, if you're not too tired." Lillian agreed immediately, and they set off together, leaving the town behind as they climbed the dusty trail. The day was warm but not unpleasantly so, with a breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Yates pointed out landmarks as they walked, telling her stories about the area, about the gold rush days when thousands of men had swarmed these hills looking for fortune. "Most of them found nothing," he said. "Went home broke or moved on to the next strike, but some stayed, built lives here. My uncle was one of them. He never struck it rich, but he found something better, a place to belong." "Is that what you found too?" Lillian asked. "A place to belong." Yates was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "I thought so. The ranch keeps me busy, gives me purpose, but sometimes it feels lonely, like something is missing." They reached the top of the hill, and Yates was right. The view was breathtaking. They could see the whole valley spread out below them, Sonora nestled in the center, the roads leading away like ribbons in all directions. Beyond were more hills, more mountains, the vast wild landscape of California stretching to the horizon. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed. "It is," Yates agreed, but when she glanced at him, he was looking at her, not the view. The intensity in his green eyes made her breath catch. "Lillian," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name. "I know we've only known each other a few days. And I know the circumstances of our meeting were less than ideal, but I need to tell you something." Lillian's heart was pounding. "What is it?" "From the moment I saw you, something changed," Yates said slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "I can't explain it. But when I held your hands yesterday, when I was trying to help you breathe, I felt something I've never felt before. Like you were meant to find your way to me. Like I'd been waiting for you without knowing it." "Yates," Lillian whispered, and she found herself reaching for his hand. He took it immediately, his fingers lacing through hers. "I know it's too soon," he continued. "I know I should wait, should court you properly, but life is short and uncertain out here. Yesterday proved that, and I don't want to waste time pretending I don't feel what I feel." "What do you feel?" Lillian asked, though her own heart was already answering the question. "I feel like I could fall in love with you," Yates said simply. "Like maybe I already am." Tears sprang to Lillian's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I feel the same way. I know it's sudden, I know it doesn't make sense. But there's something about you that makes me feel safe and understood. Like I can be myself without pretense." Yates stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Lillian said, and then his lips were on hers, soft and warm and sure. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and questioning, and Lillian felt it all the way down to her toes. When they broke apart, she was breathless again, but this time with joy instead of fear. They stayed on the hilltop for a long time, talking and sharing their stories, their hopes and dreams and fears. Yates told her about losing his parents, about the hard years working the gold fields with his uncle, about the satisfaction he found in building something with his own hands. Lillian told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her parents' deaths, about the broken engagement that had left her feeling unwanted and unworthy. "He was a fool," Yates said fiercely. "Any man who could walk away from you isn't worth a moment of your regret." "I don't regret it anymore," Lillian said honestly. "If he hadn't broken our engagement, I never would have come here, never would have met you." "Then I'm grateful to him," Yates said, "even though he's still a fool." They walked back to town as the afternoon faded into evening, their hands linked, their shoulders brushing. When they reached the school, Yates pulled her close one more time, kissing her forehead gently. "I want to court you properly," he said. "With the whole town watching, so everyone knows my intentions are honorable. Will you let me?" "Yes," Lillian said, smiling up at him. "Yes, I will." The next weeks were the happiest Lillian had ever known. She started teaching and discovered that she loved it even more than she had imagined. Her students were eager and bright, hungry for knowledge. She taught them reading and writing, arithmetic and geography, history and science. She treated all the children equally, regardless of their background, and quickly earned their respect and affection. Several of the parents came to thank her personally for the attention she gave their children, for making them feel valued and capable. Through it all, Yates was a constant presence. He came to town twice a week, always finding an excuse to stop by the school. He brought her things from his ranch: fresh eggs, vegetables from his garden, wildflowers he had picked on the hillside. He took her on picnics by the river, on rides through the countryside, on walks through town where everyone could see them together. True to his word, he courted her openly and honorably, making his intentions clear to everyone. The town watched with approval and growing affection. Mrs. Brennan told anyone who would listen that she had known from the first moment that Yates and Lillian were meant for each other. Reverend Gaines smiled every time he saw them, and made knowing comments about planning weddings. Even the sheriff, a gruff man named Harrison who had taken Lillian's statement about the stagecoach attack, told Yates that he had good taste. One evening in early June, about 6 weeks after Lillian had arrived in Sonora, Yates took her back to the hilltop where they had first kissed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange, and the air was soft and warm. They sat on the same rock where they had sat before, and Yates took both of her hands in his. "Lillian Carter," he said, his green eyes serious and full of love. "These past weeks with you have been the best of my life. You've brought light and joy to days that used to feel empty. You've made me believe in things I thought were only in stories. I love you completely and forever. Will you marry me?" Lillian felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Yates Fletcher, I will marry you. I love you too with all my heart." Yates pulled a small ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a single small diamond. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "My uncle saved it for me. I always hoped I'd find someone worthy to give it to. You're that someone, Lillian. You're everything." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her, deep and passionate, and Lillian wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love and joy she felt. When they finally broke apart, the sun had set and the stars were beginning to appear. They were married a month later in late July, in the little chapel where Lillian had first seen Yates sitting in the back pew. The whole town turned out for the wedding. Mrs. Brennan cried happy tears. Reverend Gaines beamed as he performed the ceremony. The children from Lillian's school threw wildflowers as she and Yates walked down the aisle as husband and wife. It was perfect, everything Lillian had ever dreamed a wedding could be. The reception was held in the town square, with tables laden with food that everyone had contributed. There was dancing and music, laughter and celebration that lasted well into the night. But eventually, Yates and Lillian slipped away, riding together to his ranch, where Lillian would now make her home. The ranch was 5 miles north of town, set in a green valley with a stream running through it. The house was larger than Lillian had expected, a sturdy log structure with a covered porch and real glass windows. Inside, it was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large fireplace in the main room, a kitchen with a good stove, and a bedroom with a bed that Yates had built himself. "Welcome home, Mrs. Fletcher," Yates said, carrying her over the threshold. Lillian laughed with pure joy, her arms around his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder. That night they made love for the first time, and it was tender and sweet and passionate all at once. Yates was gentle with her, patient and caring, making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window, and Lillian had never felt more complete. "Are you happy?" Yates murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Lillian said honestly. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that I found you, that you love me." "Believe it," Yates said, kissing her forehead. "You're stuck with me now, for better or worse." "For better," Lillian said firmly. "Always for better." Life on the ranch was hard work, but Lillian thrived on it. She had decided not to return to teaching for the fall term, wanting to focus on making a home and learning the ways of ranch life. She discovered that she loved the physical labor, the satisfaction of seeing tangible results from her efforts. She learned to tend the garden, to preserve fruits and vegetables, to cook on the wood stove, to care for the chickens and milk the cow. Yates taught her to ride properly, and she began accompanying him when he checked on the cattle, learning the rhythms and demands of ranch work. They were partners in the truest sense, working side by side, sharing decisions, building a life together. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, talking about their plans and dreams. Yates wanted to expand the herd, maybe buy the adjoining property if it ever came up for sale. Lillian wanted to start a small school on the ranch for the children of neighboring families who lived too far from town to attend regularly. They talked about children of their own, about the family they would build together. The bandits who had attacked the stagecoach were never caught. The posse had followed their trail for 2 days before losing it in rough country. Sheriff Harrison believed they had fled to Mexico, and there was nothing more that could be done. Lillian made peace with that. Justice would have been satisfying, but it wasn't necessary for her to heal. She had survived, had found love and happiness beyond what she had lost. That was enough. Autumn came, painting the hillsides gold and red. Lillian and Yates worked long days preparing for winter, cutting firewood, stocking the cellar with preserved food, making sure the cattle had access to winter pasture. It was satisfying work, made more so by doing it together. At night, they curled up together in front of the fire, reading or talking or simply enjoying each other's presence. In November, Lillian discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a little fear. They were far from town, far from a doctor, and childbirth was dangerous on the frontier. But Mrs. Brennan, who had assisted at many births, assured them that she would be there when the time came, and that Lillian was young and healthy and would likely have no trouble. Winter was mild that year, with only a few hard freezes. Lillian spent the long evenings knitting baby clothes and preparing the small room next to their bedroom as a nursery. Yates built a cradle from pine wood, carving designs into the headboard with painstaking care. They talked about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the world they were bringing a child into. "You ever regret it?" Yates asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on the small swell of Lillian's belly. "Leaving Ohio, coming to such a hard place." "Never," Lillian said firmly. "This is where I was meant to be, with you. Nothing else matters." Their son was born on a warm day in early May, almost exactly a year after Lillian had first arrived in Sonora. The labor was long and difficult, but Mrs. Brennan and 2 other women from town were there to help, and Yates stayed by Lillian's side the whole time, holding her hand and telling her she was strong. She could do this. He loved her. When the baby finally came, red-faced and screaming, Lillian wept with relief and joy. "A boy," Mrs. Brennan announced, wrapping the infant in a soft blanket. "A healthy, beautiful boy." They named him Samuel, after Yates's uncle who had raised him. Little Sam had his father's green eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the first moment they held him, Lillian and Yates were completely in love. The exhaustion and fear of childbirth faded away, replaced by wonder at this tiny, perfect person they had created together. The first months of Sam's life were a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry, but also of profound joy. Lillian loved being a mother, loved the weight of her son in her arms, the sound of his gurgles and cries, the way he looked at her with complete trust and need. Yates was a devoted father, endlessly patient, always ready to walk the floor with a fussy baby so Lillian could rest. By the time Sam was 6 months old, Lillian was ready to think beyond the immediate demands of motherhood. She started tutoring a few children from neighboring ranches, teaching them to read in the afternoons while Sam napped. It wasn't a proper school, but it was a start, and the parents were grateful. Word spread, and soon she had 5 regular students, then 8. Yates built on a room to the house to serve as a classroom, and Lillian ordered books and supplies from San Francisco. 2 years after Sam was born, their daughter arrived. Grace was quieter than her brother had been, more observant with Lillian's brown eyes and Yates's serious expression. Sam adored his baby sister from the start, always wanting to help care for her, to bring her toys, to make her smile. Watching her children together filled Lillian with a contentment so deep, it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work, of small joys and occasional hardships. There were droughts that tested their resources, hard winters that took some of the cattle, a fire one summer that came dangerously close to the ranch before the wind shifted. But through it all, Lillian and Yates faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each challenge overcome. The school on the ranch grew too, until Lillian was teaching 15 children from families scattered across the surrounding hills. She loved the work, loved shaping young minds and seeing the spark of understanding in her students' eyes. Yates supported her fully, taking on extra work around the ranch so she would have time for teaching, helping the older children with practical lessons in animal husbandry and land management. When Sam turned 8 and Grace was 6, they began going into Sonora once a month for supplies and to visit old friends. The town had grown over the years, more established now, more civilized. The roughest elements had moved on to new frontier towns, leaving behind people who were building permanent lives. Mrs. Brennan was still running the hotel, though her hair was now completely gray. Reverend Gaines was still preaching, though he had a young assistant now who handled many of the day-to-day duties. Sheriff Harrison had retired, replaced by a younger man who Yates had helped train. On one of these trips to town, when Lillian was walking down the main street with Grace holding her hand and Sam running ahead, she saw a stagecoach pull in. A young woman stepped out, looking around with wide, nervous eyes, clutching a carpetbag to her chest. She was clearly new to Sonora, clearly uncertain and perhaps frightened by the rough frontier town. Lillian felt a rush of recognition, remembering herself 9 years ago, stepping off a stage in a strange town, not knowing that her life was about to change forever. She walked over to the young woman with a smile. "Welcome to Sonora," she said warmly. "I'm Lillian Fletcher. If you need any help finding your way, I'd be happy to assist." The young woman's face lit up with relief. "Thank you so much. I'm the new teacher at the school. I just arrived and I'm feeling rather overwhelmed." Lillian laughed. "I know exactly how you feel. Come, let me introduce you to some people, and I'll tell you about a wonderful rancher named Yates Fletcher who saved my life when I first arrived here." As she walked with the young teacher, Grace still holding her hand and Sam running back to join them, Lillian caught sight of Yates across the street. He was loading supplies into their wagon, but he looked up as if sensing her gaze. When their eyes met, he smiled, that warm smile that still made her heart skip even after 9 years of marriage. He raised his hand in a small wave, and Lillian waved back, her heart full of love and gratitude. She thought about that first day, about how terrified she had been when the bandits attacked the stage, about how her hands had shaken with fear until Yates took them in his and taught her to breathe, about how a moment of terror had become the beginning of the greatest love story she could have imagined. Life on the frontier was hard, there was no denying that. But it was also beautiful and full of possibility. And with Yates by her side, Lillian knew she could face anything. That evening, after they had returned to the ranch and put the children to bed, Lillian and Yates sat together on the porch as they had done countless times before. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Yates had his arm around Lillian's shoulders and she was leaning against him, perfectly content. "What are you thinking about?" Yates asked softly. "About how lucky I am," Lillian said. "About how everything that seemed terrible at the time led me to you, to this life, to our children." "I'm the lucky one," Yates said, kissing the top of her head. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed, a family, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving." "We gave it to each other," Lillian corrected gently. "That's what love is, building something beautiful together." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, one by one, in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear Sam laughing at something Grace had said, their children's voices a sweet melody of innocence and joy. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, settling down for the night. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and grass and the wild sage that grew on the hillsides. "You ever think about that day?" Lillian asked after a while. "The day we met." "Every day," Yates said. "I thank God for it every single day, for being in the right place at the right time, for having the chance to help you, for everything that came after." "My hands were shaking so badly," Lillian remembered. "I couldn't breathe, I thought I might die from fear." "But you didn't," Yates said. "You were strong, even when you didn't feel strong. You just needed someone to remind you to breathe." "You did more than that," Lillian said, turning to look at him. In the fading light, his face was the same face she had fallen in love with, though there were a few more lines around his eyes now, a few threads of gray in his hair. He was still the most handsome man she had ever seen, still the kindest and most gentle. "You gave me everything. A reason to be brave, a reason to hope, a love I never imagined I could have." Yates cupped her face in his hands, those strong, calloused hands that had held her steady when she couldn't stop shaking. "You gave me the same, Lillian. Every day with you is a gift, every moment." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and Lillian kissed him back with all the love in her heart. When they finally pulled apart, the last light had faded from the sky and the stars were brilliant overhead, thousands of them scattered across the darkness like diamonds. "Come on," Yates said, standing and pulling Lillian to her feet. "Let's go inside, check on the children, make sure the fire is banked for the night, all the ordinary things that make up our extraordinary life." Lillian smiled and took his hand, their fingers lacing together as naturally as breathing. Together they walked into their home, into the warmth and light and love that they had built together over 9 years of marriage. And as Lillian closed the door behind them, shutting out the night and the wild frontier beyond, she knew that she had found everything she had ever been looking for. The months and years continued to roll by in their steady rhythm. Sam grew into a strong, thoughtful boy who loved working on the ranch with his father. He had Yates's patience and gentleness with animals, and by the time he was 12, he could rope a steer nearly as well as any grown man. Grace was quieter, more studious, always with her nose in a book. She helped Lillian with teaching and showed a natural talent for explaining difficult concepts in ways the younger children could understand. When Sam was 14 and Grace was 12, Lillian gave birth to twins, a surprise that left both her and Yates delighted and slightly overwhelmed. Thomas and Charlotte arrived on a snowy December morning, two perfect babies with loud voices and endless appetite. Sam and Grace rose to the challenge of having infant siblings, helping with feeding and diaper changes and endless walks to soothe crying babies. The ranch continued to prosper under Yates's careful management. He had expanded the herd significantly and added a breeding program for horses that brought in extra income. The little school Lillian ran had become well known in the area, and parents traveled from far distances to have their children taught by Mrs. Fletcher, who was famous for her patience and effectiveness as a teacher. One spring evening, when the twins were 5 years old and running wild through the house, when Sam was talking about courting the blacksmith's daughter and Grace was planning to go to San Francisco to attend the new women's college there, Lillian stood on the porch and watched Yates working with a young horse in the corral. He was grayer now, his face more lined, but he moved with the same sure grace he always had. And when he looked up and saw her watching, his face lit up with the same love that had been there from the beginning. He finished with the horse and walked over to the porch, climbing the steps to stand beside her. Without speaking, he pulled her into his arms and Lillian leaned against him, breathing in his familiar scent. "Happy?" he asked, as he had asked so many times over the years. "Always," Lillian answered, as she always did. "With you, always." They stood together watching the sun set over the mountains, watching their children play in the yard, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the evening. It was an ordinary moment, one of thousands they had shared over their years together. But it was also extraordinary, filled with the deep peace and contentment that came from a life built on love and partnership and mutual respect. "You remember what you told me that first day?" Lillian asked. "When my hands wouldn't stop shaking, I remember," Yates said softly. "I told you to breathe with me slow." "It was the best advice anyone ever gave me," Lillian said. "Not just for that moment, but for everything that came after, breathing together, moving together, building a life together, one breath at a time. We've done well, haven't we?" Yates said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "Built something good and strong." "We have," Lillian agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, as their children's laughter echoed across the ranch, as the cattle settled in the pastures, and the horses nickered softly in the barn, Lillian felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. For the stagecoach attack that had brought her to Yates, for his steady hands and calm voice when she had needed them most, for every day since then that they had spent building this beautiful, chaotic, perfect life together. The wild frontier that had seemed so frightening when she first arrived was home now, as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. The hardships that had once seemed insurmountable were just part of life, challenges to be faced and overcome together. And the love that had sparked between two strangers in a moment of crisis had grown into something deep and enduring, something that would last the rest of their lives. "Come inside," Yates said eventually, as he always did. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," Lillian said, not ready to let go of this perfect moment just yet. "I want to look at the stars a little longer." So they stood together on the porch of their ranch house, under the vast California sky, surrounded by everything they had built and everyone they loved. And Lillian thought about the girl she had been, terrified and shaking on a dusty road, not knowing that the man kneeling beside her would become her whole world. She thought about all the moments in between, the good and the difficult, the joyful and the challenging. She thought about births and deaths, laughter and tears, the endless cycle of seasons on the ranch. She thought about her children, who were growing up strong and confident in this wild land, who knew nothing but love and security and the certainty that they were valued. And she thought about Yates, her partner in love, who had taught her to breathe when fear threatened to overwhelm her, who had been teaching her ever since to breathe through every moment of life, good and bad, to be present, to be grateful, to love deeply and without reservation. "Thank you," she whispered, turning to look up at him. "For what?" Yates asked, puzzled. "For everything," Lillian said simply. "For saving me that day, for loving me every day since, for giving me this life." Yates smiled and pulled her closer, kissing her forehead with infinite tenderness. "Thank you for letting me, for choosing me, for building this with me." They finally went inside then, into the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of their family. Sam was trying to teach the twins a card game while Grace read aloud from a book, her voice rising and falling in dramatic emphasis. The house smelled of the stew Lillian had made for dinner, of wood smoke and lamp oil and the indefinable scent of home. Years continued to pass in their steady march. Sam married the blacksmith's daughter, a sweet girl named Emily, and they had 3 children who came to visit the ranch often. Grace went to San Francisco for college, but returned after 2 years, homesick for the mountains and the open spaces. She married a young lawyer in Sonora and became involved in civic affairs, pushing for better schools and public services. The twins, Thomas and Charlotte, remained inseparable, both of them showing Yates's talent with horses and Lillian's love of learning. When Lillian turned 50, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. There were 14 grandchildren running around by then, filling the house with noise and laughter. Yates had built additions to the house over the years to accommodate visiting family, and every room was full. The celebration lasted 3 days, with huge meals and games and music and dancing. On the last evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, Lillian and Yates slipped away to their favorite spot on the hillside above the ranch. It was the same place he had proposed to her so many years ago, and they came here often when they wanted to be alone together, to talk or just to sit in companionable silence. The moon was full and bright, casting silver light over the valley below. They could see the house, windows glowing with lamplight, could see the barn and corrals, the stream that ran through their property, the pastures where the cattle grazed. 27 years of hard work and love all spread out before them. "We did it," Lillian said softly. "We built something lasting." "We did," Yates agreed. He was 60 now, his hair more gray than brown, his face deeply lined by sun and weather. But his green eyes were still bright, still full of love when he looked at her. "And it's not finished yet. We've got years ahead of us still." "Good," Lillian said, taking his hand. "I'm not ready to be done with you yet." They sat together watching the moon rise higher, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind in the trees, the distant call of an owl. Lillian thought about the long journey that had brought her here, all the twists and turns and unexpected moments that had shaped her life. She thought about fear and courage, about finding strength in the darkest moments, about the transformative power of love. "You know what I think about most?" Lillian said after a while, "When I look back on everything." "What's that?" Yates asked. "That moment when you told me to breathe with you slow," Lillian said. "It wasn't just about calming down from the attack. It was about learning to breathe through life, to slow down, to be present. To trust that I wasn't alone, that someone was there beside me, breathing with me, helping me find my rhythm." "You've always had that strength," Yates said. "I just helped you remember it." "No," Lillian said firmly. "We gave it to each other. That's what makes it real. That's what makes it last." Yates pulled her close, and Lillian rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, matching her own breathing to his as she had done 1,000 times before. This was what love was, she thought. Not the dramatic moments, though those had their place. But these quiet times, breathing together, moving together through the rhythms of life, being present for each other in every moment, good and bad, exciting and ordinary. More years passed, each one precious, each one filled with its own joys and sorrows. There were more grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch was passed down to Thomas, who ran it with the same care and dedication his father had shown. Grace became a leader in Sonora's civic life, working tirelessly to improve conditions for everyone in the community. Sam's children followed him into various trades, all of them hardworking and honest, carrying forward the values Lillian and Yates had instilled in their family. When Lillian was 65, she finally retired from teaching. Her last student graduated on a warm spring day, and the whole community came out to honor Mrs. Fletcher, who had taught 3 generations of children and had never stopped believing in the power of education to change lives. There were speeches and presents, tears and laughter, and Lillian felt deeply satisfied with the work she had done. Yates was slowing down too, his body showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor. But he still rode out most mornings to check the cattle, still worked alongside Thomas and the ranch hands, still refused to fully retire. "I'll rest when I'm dead," he told Lillian when she worried about him overdoing it. "Until then, I've got work to do." On their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered again. There were over 30 people crowded into and around the ranch house, 4 generations of Fletchers, all descended from Lillian and Yates's love. They roasted a whole steer and tables were laden with dishes everyone had contributed. There was music and dancing that lasted well into the night. When the celebration was winding down and people were beginning to drift off to bed, Yates took Lillian's hand and led her out to the porch. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their courtship, their wedding, every significant moment of their lives together. 40 years, Yates said wonderingly. Where did the time go? Into building all of this, Lillian said, gesturing to the house full of family, to the ranch spread out around them. Into living, into loving each other. I'd do it all again, Yates said. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it as long as it was with you. Me too, Lillian said, tears streaming down her face. Every single moment. They kissed then, a kiss that held 40 years of love and partnership, of shared dreams and faced challenges, of breathing together through every moment of their lives. When they pulled apart, Lillian was smiling through her tears. "You remember what you told me to do?" she asked. "That very first day." "I remember," Yates said, pulling her close. "I told you to breathe with me slow." "Best advice I ever received," Lillian said, "then and now and always." They stood together on the porch, surrounded by family and love and the beautiful life they had built, breathing together in the moonlight. In and out, slow and steady, the rhythm that had carried them through 40 years of marriage and would carry them through however many more they had left. It was an ordinary moment and an extraordinary one, like so many moments in their long life together. But that was what made it perfect, Lillian thought. The ordinariness of it. The simple act of breathing together, of being present with each other, of choosing love every single day. The wild frontier that had once seemed so dangerous and foreign was home now, had been home for more than 4 decades. The fear that had once made her hands shake had been transformed into strength and courage and resilience. And the cowboy who had knelt beside her on a dusty road and taught her to breathe had become her whole world, her partner in everything, her greatest love. As the moon climbed higher and the stars wheeled overhead, As their family slept peacefully under the roof they had built, Lillian and Yates Fletcher stood together and breathed. Slow and steady, in and out, together as they had been for 40 years and would be for the rest of their lives. It was enough. It was everything. It was love.